Catherine E. McKinley is a curator and writer whose books include the critically acclaimed Indigo, In Search of the Color That Seduced the World, released in 2012, and The Book of Sarahs, a Family in Parts from 2002, a memoir about growing up Black and Jewish in the 1960s through the 1980s. McKinley is a former Fulbright scholar and has taught creative nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Columbia University. The McKinley Collection, the feature of this evening's talk, is a personal archive representing African photographs from 1870 to the present. She lives in New York City. Erika Massaquoi is a designer and curator. Her curatorial work includes exhibitions for the Seattle Art Museum, the Frye Museum of Art, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology List Visual Art Center, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. Along with Pamela Mikulski, Massaquoi wrote Disguise, Masks and Global African Art, published in 2015. She has taught digital media, cinema, and contemporary art classes at Yale University, NYU, and the New School. She is also founder and CEO of the Vula Company, a women's wear business that designs and manufactures vibrant garments from African wax fabric that are sourced globally and made in the USA. McKinley's book, The African Lookbook, A Visual History of 100 Years of African Women, is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Catherine McKinley and Erika Massaquoi.
Thanks so much for having us. I guess I want to begin with letting everybody know that Catherine and I are good friends. She was pivotal in helping me when I was thinking about starting the Vula Company, and I just love her new book, The African Lookbook. I feel that it encompasses really the breadth and depth of her personal work and her professional work, centering on creating a personal archive, textiles, pieces of the history of indigo, as well as portraiture and photography. So just to begin, Catherine, let's begin at the beginning and tell us a little bit about how you began collecting photographs and why you began collecting them and how that turned into a personal archive for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really began in 1991 when I was traveling. I was making my first trips to West Africa at the time, and I would stay in someone's house or make friends in the area, and people would give you a photograph as a parting gift. And they were just beautiful photos because they were costly, and it was very much an occasion to go to a studio and have a picture taken. So everybody was kind of in their Sunday best and felt very precious and important. So I kept those photos. And then later when I was working on Indigo, I was researching fashion and researching kind of like the earliest history of indigo textiles. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't very much, the colonial archive wasn't helpful, the sketchbooks and that sort of thing. So I started to ask, like, when are the earliest photographies? And that was 1865. And later. And so I went back to those photos. And as I poked around, I started to acquire as well. And then it's been steady for years now. I've been not intentionally acquiring to do the work that I'm doing now, but it became its own thing over time.
Yeah, I feel like it's organically happened for you. And what I like the most about it, I mean, in this moment, if we're going to connect, the past with the presentness and talk about this project as a form of revisionist history and reframing the history of African women in photography. What speaks to you the most, I guess? What's the biggest takeaway from collecting this archive of work and presenting it to the world?
Well, I felt like if you look at the colonial archive, it's disproportionately female. Mm-hmm. And the portrayals are very troubling in most cases, or maybe more or less problematic as you look through all the variations in it. But I also, when Seydou Keita and Malik Sidibe's work was introduced, it was, it was like a storm. Everybody.
Oh, yeah. In the 90s, it was huge. It was like the contemporary art world everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And then I started to say, okay, I have some images like this that people have given me along the way. Like, what is this really all about? And why has this representation of women been hidden in the way that it has? And so it became like a kind of determination to put it all together and see, the difference between a sitte shot like the one that's on the screen now and the colonial nudes, or
Absolutely.
other photos where women were debased and objectified, or even if it was slightly honorific, there was something troubling about it.
Yeah,
So,
and tell us.
Mhm.
Yeah, what I've been really, I guess what's amazing for me in the book is the takeaway of the diversity of the photographers.
Yes.
Of course, there's always like the European gaze, but then there's also like, the African gaze as well, with Creole photographers, specifically in Sierra Leone, and how they were, forming this narrative of women and creating curio that was to be used as a form of trade. So take us through the history, a timeline, if you will, of who was photographing, for what audiences, and for what economic end.
Well, if you look, Senegal had some of the earliest studios. And if you take Senegal as a kind of case study, so around the mid 1860s, the earliest studios are present in Senegal. And the equipment is coming as part of the empire. It's part of the colonial trade. It's used very deliberately as a tool to classify and subjugate and, do all kinds of things, and to set colonial policy. But at the same time, there were African photographers who were quickly acquiring the equipment and setting up studios, and who were traveling along the coast from Senegal all the way to Gabon and, up into the interior, into the Sahel. There were Caribbean photographers, African-American photographers. So this is in the 1865 to the beginning of the next century. And there were Arab photographers as well, all men. But they set up very varied studios. And the studios became, there was something aspirational about the studios, where some were for the very elite colonial class, some were for elite Africans, some were for like civil servant class. And there was this kind of aspirational thing of wanting to be able to afford the next rung, or to afford the studio that was in vogue at the moment. And that was similar in other countries as well. Senegal was just like the case of the kind of, perhaps the more diverse and earlier studios. So at the same time, a lot of people dismiss what we call the colonial archive, but in fact, all these images that you see, because it's under a colonial economy, are in fact part of a colonial archive, whoever the person is that was taking them.
Absolutely. And it's important to talk about these photographs, particularly from the 1865 point of time, where concurrently it was the photography, I guess, phase was happening concurrently with the trade of sugar and the trade of textiles and the trade of porcelain. So when you think about that all mixed together, and you think about the economic diversity in terms of the people who were presented in the photograph. I'm looking at the photograph we have now, and I believe she's wearing velvet. Am I right?
Yes.
And so and since we're on this particular photograph, because I know there is some significance to it, talk about the way in which your status in society was signified through various through various forms of dress, as well as through various forms of objects you would hold in your hand while you were being photographed.
Right. A lot of the objects were props, particularly not only in the colonial studios, but there was like a kind of curio of, let the African hold the accordion, that sort of thing. And then there were in the African studios, it was more about displays of status. And you can quickly, if you look at the photos, you can kind of feel out the differences in those. Cloth was always a form of currency. And it was, in most coast, like what I call the African Atlantic, in most countries, let's say Ghana in particular, for the entire span of the colonial empire, cloth represented between 40 and 60% of imported goods. It was a very, very powerful economic bloc. And then within societies, the wearing of cloth and the very fine gradations of cloth were very, very important. And they were important to women's wealth and power because it was the way that a lot of their wealth was stored and exchanged.
Yeah, almost is similar to jewelry. Cloth was, just as valuable, let's say, as gold. It would be your security, if you will. You know what I mean? And women were given cloth when they were born, and they held onto it through their lives. They collected it. They received it as dowries. They were, draped in it on their deathbeds. So it's really interesting to me, just as, myself, being a lover of textiles, the economics of how textiles informed the way women were perceived, and also the way women projected their wealth in terms of having their own independent wealth, which is something that really, really stands out to me. This idea that, of course, you can, be married to a husband, but in and of itself, depending on the way you draped yourself in textiles, it signified a certain amount of wealth as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that is fascinating to me. As I create Ula, it's all about these easy silhouettes, and it's all about the fabric speaking in and of itself. And this ideal of textile presenting not only wealth, but resilience and strength and power. I'm fascinated by that historical trajectory.
Some of that had to do with what you actually had in what you would call your cloth box, which was the equivalent of a wardrobe. And a woman's cloth box was, a very private and important possession. And it was the kind of thing that on a woman's death, they would open the cloth box, and it would tell a story of the woman's life and the life of the women before her, because she would have inherited cloth from other family members. But, cloth was always chosen carefully and deliberately for different occasions to signify all kinds of things. So a woman's cloth box would really reveal, every birth, every death, every kind of important moment of passage in her life. And it would also reveal her wealth. And it's something that would be counted and buried with her and divided up between other people at the end of her life. But, the idea of acquiring cloth for status was very important. It was also a way for women to hide and control their wealth in a way. Like if a married woman was given cloth as a monthly allowance, like here's X number of dollars to buy cloth, because that cloth is important to every social activity that you're involved in. It was a way to sequester money, to hide it from others, to avoid your husband's control of your own finances and that sort of thing. And, where currencies would devalue enormously from one moment to the next, cloth never devalued. So good cloth never lost its value at all. Over 60, 70 years, it would only appreciate. And so that it also became a very, very important economic tool. And then women that had the ability to sell and trade and have some involvement in the cloth trade at times had enormous, enormous social and political power. And so you stories of indigo dyers in Nigeria who at the turn of the century were able to depose a king, just based on the wealth and the power of the work that they did.
Tell us a little bit. I know you weren't able to find it, if I'm correct, but we have all this history of women as sitters, but not women as photographers. Yeah. Have you not been able to find any women who were photographers?
It's an abiding question. It's something I'm putting people out on this, out on this question. We're going to try to solve this mystery. But, the kind of popular history says that Felicia Bond in 1956, just on the eve of Ghana's independence, was the first female studio photographer. She ran a studio. She worked for the state. She worked for the Nkrumah government. So she's a very important figure. But if you go back at times you pick up other hints. There's a woman named Carrie Lumpkin who was a Saro. She was a Brazilian, the descendant of slaves. She returned to Nigeria and was part of this social class called the Saros in Nigeria. Yeah. And she owned a studio, but it's unclear whether she was actually a photographer or if she just had the studio for enterprise.
Yeah,
So it's a very hidden history.
It is a hidden history, and I feel like there are some nuggets there. I mean, if you think about what was happening in the 20s and 30s just in Harlem, and we've uncovered women who were behind the lens, if you will. I can only imagine that, that's just a dissertation for someone waiting to happen, uncovering, the history of women like behind the lens, and also the narratives that they were telling in terms of framing this portraiture. Is very
really
interesting.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
You don't really see a critical mass of African women photographers until around the late 1990s, early 2000s. And then when that emergence is really fascinating because they were completely unbound by the studio. Whereas you see even now, contemporary African male photographers are always referencing the studio. It's a kind of, I mean, that also has to do with the art market and its demands, or what people imagine the demand is. But, you get people like Zanelli Maholi and others who just stepped out and did this very inventive, expansive, imaginative, really brilliant work. So I think there's something to be said for not having been stuck in the tradition.
Well, yeah, because then the world is your canvas, in that sense. And, women, if you think about contemporary African photography, particularly that is photographed by women, the way that they're able to define their own sense of style and their own sense of narrative. I mean, it's palatable. You can just look at it and there's their feeling to it. There's almost a tactile intimacy to it, in the way that they approach their work. And speaking of intimacy, I wanted to get a little bit back to your own personal reasons, for connecting with the work. You've talked a little bit about wanting to sort of get rid of this sort of specter of of not being legitimate because of your personal background. So tell us a little bit about your personal background and how that relates to your professional work.
Yeah, I grew up adopted. I was one of the 15,000 transracial adoptees in the 1960s and 70s. So there's like a 10-year brief period where they segregated childcare, foster care, et cetera, in the country. And so I grew up in this this very waspy household with almost no information about my past. And I experienced a lot of shame, and there was a lot of searching and trying to put pieces together. So I remember in high school, I lived outside of Providence, Rhode Island, kind of between Providence and Boston. I used to go to both cities and walk around and take pictures of people, and also go to flea markets and collect photographs. And then I would take those photographs. So when I ended up going off to boarding school, and when I went to boarding school, I kind of put up all these photos and said, like, these are my people. And I think that is of this collecting, because it was also that sense, like, as a traveler to Africa in the 90s, it was easy and hard to be there. It was easy because my love was expansive and I felt very much a part of it. But it was hard because, you're trying to break into a society into societies where the travelers before you have set certain relationships that are not easy and that you're trying not to be a part of. And so cloth, dressing, photography was a very easy way to create a kind of intimacy with people. It was easy to meet the aunties or spend a lot of time in the marketplace and kind of learn that culture and become close with people there. And then all of a sudden you got invited in, and kind of like the way that you were able to understand the language of textiles and the ways that they were used socially, the more you were invited in.
I get the feeling. I mean, I got the feeling. I remember we were in Ghana together. It feels very much at home for you. And it was a natural. And I mean, I felt the same when I went to Sierra Leone. And it's something about being in the market among women and among textiles. And it's almost as though they can sense your love and appreciation for it. And once that happens, it's this organic intimacy that begins. and it's almost like the weaving of a textile, and then you're part of this larger collective, and it's bigger than you, but it's very intimate, almost like a quilt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like I mark my closeness to people by the time I've like spent in someone's bedroom, while they're dressing and talking and, being part of it's the place where you become truly a part of things.
And tell me about your relationships with the women and some specific women I know who have influenced the trajectory of your work in this book.
Yeah, there some of the women, some of my older friends are in some photographs in the book. There's one section in particular about Auntie Karama, and she appears in Indigo. She's one of the characters in my Indigo book. And she had these multiples of these very lovely photos from the 50s, like independence and a little bit before and just slightly after. And they're just brilliant photos. And it was wonderful that she had, was able to have them because she had these multiple copies. But her span of 10 years of studio portraits really tell a deep kind of history, political history. And so they take up a chapter of the book, and they're really special to me. They may be some of the most beautiful portraits in the book. And then the kind of arc of a story that they tell is really special.
And tell us a little bit, since we're talking about it, how cloth and women, they were able to signify resistance during independence through their dress.
Yeah, cloth dress was a big part of the kind of state story of independence. So in Ghana in particular, the first country to gain independence, there's this kind of uniform of dress. Like that's when you see the kaba and slit, which is now considered Ghana's national women's dress. It kind of emerged at that moment, and it is a kind of respectability and womanhood that everybody saw as part of the plan of statehood and the pride of independence itself. And so that's kind of one form. And then in other places, you'll see real resistance, like some of the photos, some of the cloth that has images of leaders that are meant to be honorific and, actually help create this kind of disgusting, cult status of leaders, and particularly leaders of that moment. You would see women take those cloths and wear them upside down or dirty, wrinkled, with a leader's face across their buttocks. And that would be another form of disgrace, because you always wore your cloth very neatly and very respectfully. So then you also see, like, for instance, in this photo, these are girls in Mali, and they're wearing what they call, yeye music from London in that period. And so it seems like a kind of resistance. It's, this great new modern state, people's emancipation through dress, this kind of comfortable or uncomfortable wedding of African and Western aesthetics. And what was really behind the scenes was a kind of, like that elder, the people who are photographed in the Keita photos, that generation starts to snap back against this. And so there are these kinds of re-education camps in Mali where they're snatching these girls off the street and saying, okay, you're going to cut the afro, you're going to get rid of the bell bottoms, you're going to do all these things, and you're going to re-adopt this kind of new indigenous dress.
And I mean, for me, being African American, I look at this picture, and then, of course, it takes me to where the manner in which African Americans were very much influenced by the movements for statehood among various African countries, and how that led to the Black arts movement and the Black political movement, and the Black is Beautiful movement, which my mother's aesthetic was totally informed by. So in terms of making those connections, and when we're talking about fabric, I get queried so many times about the manner in which Ankara, African wax fabric, has changed. And so give us in your perspective, like, just take us from like, say, 1970 to 2000, how Ankara has changed from really telling stories into something else where the narrative has in many ways fled the fabric. But at the same time, it has opened up space for more, I guess, abstract forms of meaning.
Yeah, it's changed. I think it's probably changed most considerably from 2010 until now.
Because okay.
You can most Ankara or wax fabric that's on the market now is not even, in fact, a wax process. It's just stamping of something on top.
On it, yeah.
So the wax process itself is really what gives the kind of extreme beauty to wax cloth. It's a process, like 20 stages in the process of making one wax cloth. Where the majority of what you see now is being made in Asian factories, and it's just literal stamping of a design on top. And also in the pre-1980s, most of the cloths that, so you'd have a Dutch factory produce 300 cloths, send them all abroad to be sold. And the women that were trading the cloth were making, it was as cutthroat as like a Paris atelier.
I know, they were making so much money. Yeah.
Yes, whatever. And if something was liked enough by people passing by on the street and all the network that was involved in deciding what was going to be sold and how, it would be given a name.
Yeah.
So if your cloth was given a name, then it has real status. It was something that was important. It was something that would be stored in your cloth box. It was of real value. And so the designs are losing that now. And they're also made primarily on computer desktops. And Lisco in particular, there's some fabulous designers who are there. I know a few of them. Their work is just outstanding, but it's a different animal. And those designers aren't necessarily being given names, and they're not part of that same heritage.
Well, because, in terms of Lisco, the Lisco designs, there's a shroud of secrecy behind the process and behind the naming. So it's difficult, as a documentarian, as a historian, to even record that history, which is such an important history. And I feel like, as an academic, students are hungry for that history. When you think about, textile design and product design, there seems to be a space there where that whole shroud of secrecy needs to be open. I know you've been working on that for a while now. How's that coming along?
I mean, it's interesting. A lot of it is just something I've done for myself. But I was one of the few. I mean, I think I've met 4 Black women who have made it into the Lisco archives. And I'm one of them. I mean, the place is like, it's Fort Knox. It's so hard to have an entree there. And then once inside, you see something that's like as big as a football stadium with 2-yard pieces of cloth just hanging in rows of they've just collected everything that's been produced by themselves and others, and have this vault of fabric that goes back to, they say proudly that this cloth here went up the river with Stanley. Or this one, you can see designs that go back to the Cape Coast and Elmina castles, where they were actually traded, and we can trace their history very definitively back to those trade routes. So it's a shame that it's hard to kind of uncover and share a lot of that. And at the same time, I think that there's a lot to be said for us bypassing, those gates altogether and having our own kind of social history, because one cloth may have a name that someone else has given 3 other names to. Yeah. And I think that what's more interesting is what's made of it by the women that wear it. So that's really, I've become more interested in that. Like, what are the different interpretations and ways of naming that people have given to it? And then for our generation and people that don't get to firsthand put their hands on all the iconic designs, I think there's a way that we could start to think about how, how do we bring meaning to the fabrics? What are the names that we would give this as African Americans, or as people that are living between between the two continents.
Between the two continents. And I mean, that just celebrates, your diverse heritage. But I will say, as a designer, there takes, I don't know if it's like a bit of imposter syndrome, but it took a long time for me to feel confident enough to name a piece of wax, that I was using, to like definitively name it, to give it a name or to even describe the design. And, I've been an artist since I was 12, and there was that resistance to it. But I do think that it's complicated, right? The manner in which, African Americans wear their cloth, and the way, someone on the continent, might wear their cloth. It's very, very different. I mean, when I married into my family, it was very formal. We wear it at weddings and birthdays, etc. But I remember, my mom wearing, her beautiful tunics and her dashikis, and I wanted to get to a place where I could wear it every day. And be able to celebrate, diverse Black joy and diverse history. And I think that affirmative, that's the most important piece to me, is that it represents a cultural affirmity that is never ending, and a cultural resilience that's never ending. So it's a conversation for me, is where I always begin with it. And I guess that's like a really good place for us to start, taking some queries now, because we're at that point. So if there are any questions from the audience, we'd love to have them.
All right, sorry about that delay there. I'm Shane, I'm an event manager here at Town Hall Seattle, and we will start taking audience questions here. So for those of you watching in Crowdcast, you can submit your question down below where it says ask a question. And for those of you who might be watching in YouTube, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat over there as well. Right now, we have only one question so far from Nada. Nada asks, will more of the photographs be shown? It'd be nice to see more quantity of photos. So I think for this evening, it was just the handful, but I believe in your book, there's probably many more photos. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, I think there are about 130 photos in the book.
Yeah.
There are also a lot online. You can go on Instagram and see quite a few. And I have a website as well, www.themckinleycollection.com. You can see quite a few more.
And it's important to note also that the photographs, I mean, they span a 100-year arc from, I believe it's 1870 to 1970, if I'm remembering correctly, in the book. And it goes from like, the cosmopolitan to the modern, and the historical to the anthropological to the exotica to what people would describe, as you put it, as poverty porn. Can you talk a little bit, Catherine, about those different, styles of photos that were in circulation?
Yeah, it's funny because I think it's easy to forget how much diversity there was in picture taking. It's really quite stunning. The more, like for me, collecting, part of the reason why collecting became obsessive is because it's such an education, so yeah, if you look on the surface, you can see endless like bare-breasted women, and it gets very tiring and you want to throw the whole thing out. But the deeper you get into examining the photos, the more you realize that there were just, nothing is really very easily categorizable. The only thing that's easy to say, like people talk about the gaze, and yeah, it's easy to like talk categorically about the gaze. But even within that, there's a lot going on. There are things that can be disturbing, and then there can be this whole other counter narrative going on. So and some of it is really kind of just fun, like there's some.
Yeah, it is fun, and it's amazing the way people. I mean, as a sitter in the photograph, as the subject, how you're able to affirm your own identity, just with the gaze or just with the stare. So the inverse of that gaze and what happens. I'm thinking specifically about the girls who've gone through initiation, and that mark of womanhood and the pride, you know, and that sense of coming into your own that's projected in the gaze, and the inversion of that. It's very powerful.
You see some pictures where women, and I see this too, because I've done some work with other photographers, like in Ghana in particular. There are sometimes where the relationship seems very tricky. I was with Thabiso Sakala in Namibia, and Thabiso was a South African photographer, very, very well known. You know, we were traveling in Namibia and we were clearly outsiders, but everybody kind of had their ideas about who we all were. And, you know, there were people who you might have thought that it was a difficult power relationship, and they would stare that camera down in a way that it was just like, it was very clear that we were not the ones in power. And it was very clear that they were commandeering the entire situation. And that made it harder to talk, even though we were Black artists working with them. There were very clear differentials in power, but there were ways they were taking it right back.
Yeah. And I love that, you know, like who owns the gaze and who's looking and, you know, who's posing. That's very, I'm always taken by that, particularly in this age of like the selfie where, I mean, photography is so proliferate, you know? And so it really is something, I think it's something when you actually are able to see a photograph that really captures you, you know, that stops you, because, you know, we're in a multimedia society. It's all about images. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I studied cinema. It's important, I feel, to be an artist or to be an academic and to live fully in the times that you're in. And it's a media society. And that's just who we are and what we are. But to get to a place where even within the proliferation of billions of images, there still can be that one that can just stop you. And that just talks about, like, you know, the power of the image is incredible to me. And I was also taken in the book about how women would define where their space was in history, be it religion, if they were Christian or if they were Muslim, or, you know, if they were posing with a servant or if they owned slaves. There's that one photo, I forget where the woman is from, but she has on this huge, all these bangles of ivory. So it's clearly she had a lot of slaves. And I wanted you to talk about those power dynamics and economic dynamics a bit more.
That's quite a photo. She's the Sultan's wife in Congo. And I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly the region, but she's, you know, she's sitting in a very British dress with a lace collar
and stockings.
And an armful of ivory on both
all up.
And then she's got a very, not quite abject, but she has a kind of sad younger woman yelling next to her. And I've sent down 2 other photos of her with with 2 servants and one with 3. You know, it's a troubling, it's hard to reconcile all those things, because you feel her power, you kind of celebrate it, and then you realize also on the back of other people. And she's a formidable person. I found out more about her husband's relationship, and, you know, it becomes a much murkier, much more troubled photograph. But it makes me think about all of the, you know, growing up on like Ebony and Essence and Jet, like remember the Budweiser ads?
Of course. Yeah.
You know, I was thinking, like, this photo sits so well within that narrative.
Within that narrative of all this other stuff. I mean, that's what, I mean, one of my pastimes is collecting Ebony and Jet magazines. Because they tell such a rich history. And it's an aesthetic that I'm very much, obviously, you know, inspired by from the 60s and 70s. That particular aesthetic just, I mean, because of what my mother was wearing and what my aunts and my great aunts were wearing. And of course, I wanted to be just like them. But there was this affirmation of who you are, even with all the complicated stuff around you, you know, with your cigarette and your, you know, beer or whatever it was, and how that defined you. It's very interesting to me. And it was also
generation of images was so powerful. I feel like I'm forever trying to be back inside of like the 70s of my
That's
youth.
where I'm living. I'm like caught. I am caught in that space. A person asks me, they're like, Erika, how do you define like the aesthetic of Vula? Like, what is it? How do you know?
Yeah.
And I said, it's Ula if you feel that it could have been in ebony or jet in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't feel that way, then it's not Ula. And and immediately they got it. I mean, I didn't even know that's what I was getting to, and that's a very pop cultural, reference to it. But it captures that. I'm always trying to get back to that feeling. Yeah. And if I can't create an environment, if you will, with the garment, then what am I doing? If I'm not telling a story with the garment, then I'm not a dressmaker. I just feel that strongly about that time. And so when I see these women, and I think it's more images of the women in the indigo, the way you talk about them is so great. Like, was she trying to like capture her husband's attention, or is it that, the color of the indigo just complemented her skin that day? It's just, it's so clever. So talk a little bit more about that, like the process of writing and the tone that you take to describe the photographs.
Well, some of it was, this book started out, somebody reminded me this week because they wrote and said, oh, the book's finally out, and did my picture make it in? Because it had this earlier life where I was not using my photos at all. It was, different places. And then at some point, I just felt like, okay, I have these images, I have this body, and it started to take shape. And I was like, okay, it has a historical arc, and it's doing all these things I didn't expect. So I said, okay, I'm going to work only with what I have here. And then it was a question like, how do you do that? How do you make a cohesive narrative out of images from 54 countries and, all this kind of varied stuff? So I had to start making choices. And as I was building the narrative around it, it just took on its own life. It really came like each photo kind of laid the path for the narrative.
Yeah.
Because you have to you have all these disparate things. How are you going to find a through line?
Yeah, but even with finding the through line, of course, there's your voice as the author, that you hear, but, the skill of being able to allow the reader to be active in the learning of the history by asking questions, that they have to answer. And then it becomes an interactive process. And that's what I like about it as well. Everybody, you just have to go and buy this book because it's a super quick read. I sat there and I was like, with my highlighter, because I'm just a nerd writing things, but it is super fun, and you learn a lot about yourself and the way that you view the way you define yourself as a spectator is extremely revealing through the process of reading the book. Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was. You know what? It really felt like a love letter in a lot of ways. It was like, these are the women that I want to know. These are the women that I do know. These are the women I can't get close to and I want to. It just love letter. And then it also felt like a call out to like everybody else who shares this history. And then even beyond that. So I was very conscious of like, I'm offering this to myself and to you as well.
Yeah. And also that process of looking for yourself in the photos. Yeah. Like that's, it could be, the cut of an eye, the expression, the gaze. But, when I look at photos and you don't realize it, but you are looking for, little slices of who you are and how you move through the world. And I think that that's just the gift of art, how we define ourselves through our emotional response, to images. I just think like as a curator, I'm one to shy away from framing the narrative of the spectator. My feeling is that if they're in a gallery and they can't come to their own conclusions and it isn't some type of emotional connection where they're learning and growing, then I haven't done my job, as an academic. And I think that, given the breadth and depth of your knowledge, you're able to carefully balance that within the reading of the text. You learn so much about yourself, but then like I'm always a hungry and thirsty, reader, always questioning and navel gazing. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where do I fit in? How does it belong? But I think that's the story for like Black women all over. No?
The photos also, they've had such a contested history because, they were circulated, maybe they were taken in studios and they were commissioned by a family and they had this, really important thing to the family, but then they were circulated without their permission all over the world. Each photo has like been around the world 8 times. It's really stunning. And so I also felt like this, okay, and now they're in my possession. And then there's a question about possession, who has the right to possess them, what does it mean to possess them? And I see myself more as a caretaker than, like I'm this collector of all these things.
Well, you're a good steward of the images. Because there's that.
I take good care of them. And they are, at some point, they'll go to, they're meant for something much bigger than what I'm doing at some point. But I felt really conscious of, as I'm presenting these images, people are like, today I got a nasty comment about, from a West African woman about why the hell do I have these things? And I'm thinking, but they're ours as well.
Yeah.
Ours. They're part of this thing. They're part of this Pan-African world we do live in. Away from those politics. But that was a lot of why the narrative unfolded in the way that it did. That it's for me and it's for others as well.
Absolutely. I think we have a few more questions, right, Shane?
Yeah, we have a handful here from our audience. So I have a question here from Robin, and Robin is asking, was there a specific photo that made you say, I want to see more of this, or I want to see less of this, that really solidified this path for you?
Well, the less of this is, the less of this happens more in the acquisition of the photos, because there have been times where I've seen them at auction or something like that. And I know that I'm bidding against like particularly wealthy collectors who are just going at it for them. Like they have the money, they're going to take them. And the photos just, I feel like, no, I can't let this
that happen.
That is literally at times does drive me right into the ring. And that drives my wanting to have them. I think the nudes, not just the kind of gratuitous nudes, but there are some nudes, they're in the book. I have a selection where I talk about the skin as cloth. And those nudes, like they're troubling in some ways, but there's so much beauty in them too. There's 3 in particular that are there that are very abject. One of them, she's wearing like robes and she has beads at her knees and looking into a mirror, and she has a headscarf. Yeah. And I don't know, it's just like there's something, I feel this like kind of urge to protect. Yeah. And to reclaim that. So that's how I'd answer that. And then there's just like this endless beauty. You can't, like the beauty just goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's see. We have a question here from Nadia, who asks, what were some of the exchanges like when people gave you photographs of themselves? What did they want you to know or remember? What did they tell you, or what look did they give you while you handing you the photographs?
I would say the first photograph that I was ever given was by a guy. His name is Kwame. We were in touch for a while and then we lost touch, but I went to Ghana on my first trip in 1991 and I stayed at University of Legon in like the chalet. And Kwame was a caretaker and he was like extremely helpful to me, but he was a servant. I mean, he was employed by the university, but the employment relationship was not really cool. And he was very poor, and he was in a position where he was hoping to be taken care of and to move on. And he was always just like barely in threads. And when I left, he gave me a picture of himself in like Sunday best. and he's holding a chicken, and he cooked for me. So,
Oh, he cooked for you. I love it.
you know, and it's just such a beautiful photo. Like he's dressed so nicely, and he's transformed from the person that I met. So, and then he became a pen pal. So, those photos really have a lot of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And you know that he spent good money to take the photo.
Take the photo and to share it. Yeah,
it wasn't a small thing. So.
So this next question is asking, you spoke about how changes in the production of the fabric, Ankara, forgive me if I mispronounce that, has also altered its use as a medium of protest. Are there other fabrics that have experienced similar changes?
Well, all the fabric has experienced enormous change, particularly in the last 20 years, because of the new, there've been like industrialization of fabric has happened in waves, and then it kind of revives itself as an art, and then goes back into an industrial period. But probably the biggest industrial period has been in the last 20 years, with everything being moved to Asia. So yeah, and also it's not just that, it's that I think the generation from the 90s, you started to see this waning of desire for like their mother's forms of fashion. Now, before, like if you see the 1950s photos, you see those girls in the more Europeanized things. But when it was time to get serious, they were going to put on African cloth, you know. And even in Ghana now, you're going to put on African cloth if you want to be taken seriously in any kind of, you know, if you have to go to a government office or various things, or if you're doing anything, you know.
Oh yeah, they're going to take you seriously.
Yeah.
No, it is true. You have to. You must dress. Yeah. And in your best. That's been interesting to me. The idea, and when I go, even if I'm dressed, they know that they will say, "Oh, you're African American," you know. But they respect the fact that you're dressed. And particularly when you're dressed to come and do business, which is interesting to me. And what's also interesting to me, and we talk about, you know, a lot of the fabric that's being made in, you know, Asian factories, was interests me is that the different generations that Ankara is made for, like when you go into the market now, you know, something that's like, you know, really cool looking, you know, that's clearly for like teenagers, you know, or you go dressing, or you're buying something specifically for a wedding or for a funeral. Yeah. So the whole when you think about Ankara, it's just not like this one thing, you know, it's always, even now with it, a lot of it coming out of like, you know, China and India, it's always in the process of becoming, and it's always changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this next question comes from Jacqueline, and Jacqueline asks, how is Black art and fabric being highlighted in Nigerian cinema known as Nollywood?
Oh, yeah. Nollywood.
Although Nollywood really rests, you know, like tradition is a big part of Nollywood, but so is most, you know, Nollywood is very much about jeans and
fabulousness. Yeah. And a specific Western American hip hop influence, fabulousness. It's interesting. I mean, that has been interesting to me. The nails, the weave, the hair, the jewelry, that whole aesthetic, Africanized.
So this next question comes from Karen, and Karen asks, how will projects like this be done for the present day or the future with a huge increase in volume of images that exists, mostly digitally?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, the selfie is something else. You know, I think it's going to take some time for the selfie. Like, we need a certain kind of distance on it to, not that it's going away, but we need a certain kind of distance in order to like walk around it and see what it is and say what it is. But it puts the image making in the hands of everybody. So it's really quite fascinating. It's like there was a period in post-independence era, color photography really came into play, and it was expensive. It was really in some ways the demise of the studio, because color photography was so expensive that it was primarily Asian entrepreneurs who were running those studios. And so it became, even point and shoot, which was the prelude to the selfie, was own dynamic. So I think we'll see where it goes now, like what it's cycling into.
And I think that it's still complicated, when you think about the selfie, and even though there's a certain amount of autonomy specifically for women, it's interesting to me how women are framing themselves,
Yeah.
And so it reframes narratives around, what is soft porn? What is exotica? What is the documentary? So I think it's such a rich time right now to be asking these questions, and a rich time in our history to be an image maker and to be a storyteller. So, I mean, it can, you think about the future and you think about what does this mean for the archive? I mean, now the archive is in the hands of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have time for one last question, and this is again from Jacqueline. And this question is asking, how can we keep the authenticity with these fabric and resist or cancel appropriation of this craft?
Mm.
Well, I'll say, first of all, if you go back to even like to the earliest records, African consumers of cloth have always had a penchant for what's new. Always. You go back 1400s, 1700s on. There's always been a thirst for what's new. And that's really what drove that enormous value of cloth in African societies. So yeah, I think we can mourn the loss of certain things. And at the same time, I think we have to allow, there's politics, there's loss. We need to account for that. And at the same time, we need to let people like and thirst for what they want to, and figure out what these things mean along the way. Because I'm not convinced that this production of wax cloth that's not a real wax process, that to me is not as beautiful as true wax cloth. I don't think that doesn't mean that someone's great grandmother's design is not going to resurface.
I think absolutely. Mm-hmm. And this whole ideal of what's new, it wasn't only with the African wax cloth, it was what's new in brocade and lace and taffeta and silk. So, and the way those cloths were mixed, and the way you see that in the photographs, that's what I really love. Someone in like beautiful indigo, mixed with, a lace top, or something in eyelet. And how that speaks to the conversation of the Atlantic trade and back and forth. So these are...
I'm sorry, that indigo cloth isn't necessarily tradition. We might say like tradition. That indigo cloth may have been made in a workshop in the Cape Verde Islands in the 1700s with a Japanese, with wool-off dyers.
Yeah.
Japanese weaver, Portuguese merchantmen, and it was being traded by African traders all the way to Congo, and it was a very fierce market that everybody was participating in. So I think that we have to be careful. We don't want to fall back on just like the, it's a loss.
Yeah, and it's in the sort of multi-ethnic creation of that cloth. I think that gets lost oftentimes in the conversation. So I mean, there's so much history still to be told, these wonderful stories. So thank you so much, Catherine, for your beautiful and valuable book. It's really a gift.
Yes, thank you both Catherine and Erika for being here this evening. Thank you everyone else for tuning in. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Catherine's book, The African Lookbook, A Visual History of 100 Years of African Women, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company here in Seattle. And finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Erika.
Thanks.